Hey everybody, happy Blockheads Wednesday. Today I have the privilege of showing you guys Petal Pusher by Crystal Manning. It is block 15 for week 16. Let's start taking a look at this block. Alright, so if you haven't already downloaded your pattern, you can find it on our blog or on our official Moda Blockheads Facebook group. So make sure you grab your pattern and get it printed out. So we're going to be making 4 triangle and a square units, also called Peaky and Spike units, and then half square triangles, and then we're going to do like a square and a square as well. Your pattern has templates and instructions for making the Peaky and Spike units using foundation paper piecing. I'm actually going to show you how to do it using the Tri-Rex ruler. I love these Easy Quilting Tri-Rex rulers. They are so versatile and you can make a lot of blocks and a lot of different sizes. So it's a great addition to your quilting tool box. I definitely recommend them. So I'm going to show you how we're going to use those to cut our units. Okay, I'm going to start by cutting my center units. So our center triangle here in our pattern is that background fabric. So I've got a 3.5 inch width strip of fabric. I have already started cutting some of my little centers, as you can see. It's just really easy. Line up the 3.5 inch line along the bottom edge of my fabric strip, and I'm just going to cut right along that line, and that's how I get my center units. Now for cutting the side units for our triangle and a square pieces, it's a little bit different. Normally you have a right and a left. And so what we want to make sure is that when we cut the fabric, we put it right sides together. That way you end up with a reverse. You have your left one and you have your right one already. So same thing, I'm working with the mixed bag of lollies. They're the perfect size. I have cut this little rectangle into a 3.5 inch strip. So I'm going to fold this over and I'll line up the 3.5 inch line right here on the bottom edge, and I'll cut along this straight line and I'll cut along this angled line. Now there's a little notch right here at the top. I want to make sure I cut out that little notch. You can see what it looks like here. It's going to help me align all my pieces when I sew together all these units. Okay, I've gone ahead and laid out all of the different center and side triangles for my triangle and a square units. Because this pattern is a little bit tricky, you definitely want to lay everything out and make sure you have it matched up according to the pattern. Because normally we would have, you know, a matching set for the left and the right, but the effect of our block is to have these triangles in the kind of corners, so we're mixing and matching, and you want to make sure that you have the fabrics placed just right. Now that I've laid everything out, I can start sewing my side triangles to my center triangles. I start with the right one, and I'm just going to fold it over. I'm going to fold that right side triangle on top of my center triangle. Now this is where that little notch at the top makes a big difference, because it's going to line up on the bottom edge of the triangle here. And I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam along this line and press this triangle out. And then I'll repeat the process on the other side after I press out that right side triangle. So I'm going to do that for all of my triangles, and then we'll trim them down. One thing I want to show you real quick, when you sew that left triangle onto your center triangle, we're working with bias edges here. It's easy for them to get a little bit wonky. It's not as important for my left triangle bias edge here to be right along the line of my center triangle. I really just need to make sure that I overlap here so that when I press out, I've got my 1/4 inch seam allowance. If I pay more attention to this side and have it matched up, I'm going to lose that 1/4 inch seam allowance sometimes if it's a little bit wonky. So you can see that I'm not quite lined up with that center triangle. That's okay. So I press this out, and now I'm ready to trim it. I want to trim these to 3.5 inches. So I'm going to make sure that my 1 3/4 inch mark on my ruler is right here where those 2 side triangles meet up at the top. That's my point. And I've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance there so that I don't lose the point when I stitch this in. These are pretty exact. I'm not going to have to trim away much at all. All right. If you prefer to use FPP for your triangle and square units, we do a deep dive in some previous episodes, and those are linked here in this video, and you can just pause and check those out and then come back and rejoin us. Okay, now I'm ready to move to step 2, which is to make my center unit. It's a square and a square unit. So once again, I want to make sure that I have all my fabrics in the right place so that I am putting my corner squares in the right location of my center square. So I've laid those out, and I'll start by sewing a scant 1/4 inch from point to point here on these opposite corners. I'll trim that and press those out towards the green prints, and then I'll sew the opposite squares, and that's how I'm going to make my center square and a square unit. Okay, I've got my center square unit made, and now let's trim it up real quick. This needs to be trimmed to 3.5 inches. So once again, I'm going to make sure that at my points here, it's at 1 3/4 inches on my ruler. So I'll kind of line that up. I'm making sure that I'm keeping my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this came out pretty good. I'm not going to have to trim much away at all. You can see here's 1 3/4, and it's got my 1/4 inch seam allowance. There's 1 3/4, and it's got my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sewing these corner squares with a scant 1/4 inch seam is really important. That's going to help make sure that you have the full size of your center unit. It'll be a full 3.5 inches when you trim it. Okay, now I'm ready to do my half square triangles, and that'll be a whole lot easier. Okay, because we're only making 1 half square triangle per print, we put our background and print squares right sides together. We're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam just outside this point to point. So normally you would draw a line from point to point, and then you'd sew a scant 1/4 inch on either side. We're just going to sew like a thread's width over, because if you sew right from point to point, you're not going to end up with exactly 3.5 inch half square triangles, and I'll show you because that's what I did. So read the instructions and make sure that you sew that scant 1/4 inch seam so that when you trim away the extra little bit and press it open, you've got a full 3.5 inches. Okay, I've got all of my different units ready to go. I'm ready to assemble this whole block. So when I sew my half square triangles to the triangle and a square unit, I'm actually going to press towards this triangle and a square unit. And then on my center row, I'm going to press again towards the triangle and a square units, because it's a little bit too bulky to press towards the center square and a square unit. So let me get this all assembled, and we'll talk about pressing and trimming. Okay, I've finished my block, and I love how it turned out. This one is so fun. It's got a real groovy kind of vibe to it. Definitely very retro, especially in these Jen Kingwell fabrics. So it's a little bit wonky. I know why. I'm a self-taught quilter, and I have learned over the years to kind of diagnose how my blocks go awry sometimes. And so I know for a fact one of the reasons that both of my blocks turned out a little bit off is because I didn't starch my fabric or even press it before I started cutting and sewing. For me, that makes a big difference in the end result of my blocks. Another thing that I did that I would do over if I were going to remake these blocks is I did not sew that scant 1/4 inch seam on my 3.5 inch half square triangles, and that does make a big difference. So you definitely want to do that scant 1/4 inch seam so that you end up with properly sized half square triangles. But it's okay, I can still work with this block. I want to show you guys this one in particular. It's a little bit, you know, the edge is not straight here. I like to have a straight edge to sew against when I'm joining all my blocks together. So I'm going to trim it down, and it's still going to work out just fine, even though it's just a smidge small, because my seams are still pretty straight. So you can see I've got this seam lined up along this 11-inch line. It's nice and straight. Same on this one. I'm lined up on my 14-inch line on my mat here, and it's very straight. So I'll be able to take my ruler and just kind of trim this up so that I have a straight edge. So I'm leaving a 1/4 inch here on the side, and I'm just going to trim away this little bit just to straighten my edge up for when I'm joining these blocks together. There, that's a lot better. So I'll do this all the way around, and then I'll have a much more square block to work with. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's Blockheads block. Thank you, Crystal, for Petal Pusher. What a fun block this is. I can't wait to see your versions of Petal Pusher, so don't forget to post them in our Facebook group for Moda Blockheads. If you post on Instagram, be sure and use the hashtag ModaBlockheads6. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great week.